Would you mind telling the whole story?
Sure. The poltergeist, I always thought the poltergeist started when I was 5 years old and it started raining gravel down on the roof of my family's home at night. And at the time, we didn't think this was paranormal. No one knew what was going on. I grew up in Michigan. We lived in a very rural area in the midst of the woods. My father would go out with a shotgun because he thought someone must be doing it, and he could never find any evidence that someone was doing it. He'd shoot the gun off into the air. And in the morning, he'd go up and sweep several shovelfuls of gravel off the roof. And then things became very definitely paranormal when whatever this manifestation was, went into the house. One of its favorite things to do was to throw the vacuum cleaner around. You didn't always see it. Most often you didn't. My mother, if she were vacuuming and turned the vacuum cleaner off and left it in one corner of the room and would leave the room, you'd hear it crash and go back into the room and be in the opposite side of the room. Occasionally you would see things. I saw on one occasion a glass all of a sudden just came swooping through the room from no apparent source. The windows were closed. There was no one there who could have thrown it. The poltergeist was also fond of throwing, strangely enough, pieces of drift glass and broken beer bottles or pop bottles that you find worn smooth on the beach. And once in my New York apartment, because the poltergeist followed me wherever I moved until I was in my early 20s, I actually saw one of these things materialize. I was just sort of daydreaming, looking up near the ceiling, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this strange little brown thing appeared, and as I looked at it, it came zooming down at me, hit me in the chest, dropped to the floor, and it was one of these pieces of glass. And so these were, extraordinary things, but at the same time, I and my family became so accustomed to them. I have two sisters that if we'd be playing, because another thing the poltergeist would do was stomp all over. It would stomp up the stairs, down the stairs, through the rooms. You hear bang, 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 bang. And if we were playing, it got so, if we heard something stomp up the stairs and glanced over to the stairs and there was nothing there, we'd just go back to playing. It was so mundane a part of our existence. And you said they did have negative aspects. It wasn't all positive. That's true because one of the things that I discovered and has caused me to believe that the poltergeist was an unconscious psychic projection of mine is that it was always colored by my moods. And most of the time I was in a good mood and it was mischievous. It would do silly things, like one morning I woke up with dried spaghetti noodles all over my chest and no explanation. I lived alone and unless a burglar broke in, boiled some noodles, and threw them on my chest, I don't know where they came from, and I have no history of sleepwalking or anything like that. Another instance, it took all of my socks, draped them over the plants in my house. Silly things like that. But if I were in a bad mood, if I were going through some sort of rough time in my life, the poltergeist became nasty. And there were a few occasions, not many, where stigmata-like bites would appear in my hands. A couple of times, needles, or metal objects that were halfway between nail and needle would appear out of nowhere, just zoom into my flesh. This only happened twice. Mm-hmm. And things like that. So you could construe those as negative, but on the other hand, I view them as positive because I learned so much from them.
Well, I think it's important to mention this because, in a lot of the folklore, these kinds of manifestations are associated with the demonic. And I think by using the lens of a holographic model, you're able to see it in a different light.
That's true, and it's important to note that. And one of the things that I've learned from it is when these negative things were happening, there were occasions, even though I'd had lengthy experience with this poltergeist, that I'd start to think, oh my gosh, maybe I'm being demonically attacked. When I believed that, it started to manifest even more as a demonic attack. But when I would sort of come to my senses and go, no, I know that I can see the emotional reason that this is manifesting in this way, and go, okay, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to have a positive frame of mind, all the negative stuff would stop. I always had control, but if I relinquished that control and allowed my beliefs to go into some interpretation, go, it's a demon, it's a this, it's a that, then it would get me. Mm-hmm. And there was another instance when I lived in my New York apartment where I was playing piano at night. I had the lights off. I was playing in the dark, and I live on the ground floor, and the piano is situated so that the back of the piano is toward a window. And as I was sitting there playing away, all of a sudden there was an intense burst of light in my face. It was like a flash bulb went off right in my face. And my first just sort of visceral reaction to it was, oh my gosh, a truck is driving, has come off the road and is driving through my window. So I literally threw myself over the piano thinking that I'm about to be killed by this truck or whatever. And after I sort of regained my, my senses and stood up, I looked back at the window. There was no sign of what had caused this light. And I thought, well, that is strange. And I turned back around, and as I looked in the room, there was what looked like a luminous soap bubble about 3 feet in diameter hovering in the air. And it sounds strange, but it terrified me because people go, what's so scary about a luminous soap bubble? But it was so unexpected and yet so real. And I started moving my eyes from side to side to see if it was an after image on my retina. I started blinking to see if it would go away. And it was as real as the tables and the chairs. And there was a distinct sort of feeling of evil coming from it. And I started to run out of the room, and then I caught myself, and I thought, because I'm basically just an extremely curious person by nature, and I thought, if I run out of the room, I'm always going to wonder what this thing was and what would have happened had I stayed. So I really summoned my courage, and I stopped, and I addressed it. I said, I want you to know you just scared the daylights out of me, but I want to know why you're here and what you are. And when I said this bubble, which is hovering in the air, backed up. And somehow I knew that the fact that it had backed up, that it had wanted to scare me, and it had backed up. Now this bubble appearing had been presaged by a number of very negative poltergeist phenomena. A couple of the bites that occurred at that time in this. I didn't know what was going on. The bubble after was only there for maybe a minute or two, but it seemed like an eternity at the time. Then the bubble left the room, hit a door, and sort of burst and sparkles and was gone. But distinctly negative. I knew it was a negative presence. A couple of days later, a friend called me, and I had not told her about the experience or anything. And she said, Michael, I have a letter that I think you should read. And it turned out I had just moved to New York from Michigan. I'd attended Michigan State University. And there was a group of people there that were really only acquaintances of mine. They weren't that important in my life, but they were into black magic. And somehow they had fancied, which was totally their fantasy, not mine, that I was some sort of magician and that I was attacking them. And so they were doing group meditations and casting spells to get me.
Counter magic.
Right. And I had not even thought of these people. Right. But what that taught me is that I realized that, because I still think I was in part feeding this phenomena with my own psychic energy, is that I was not shielding myself. Because what happened when I learned this, while it was going on, I was so interested, I allowed it to happen because I wanted to see where it was going. I wondered what the bubble was. I didn't say, okay, get out of my reality. But as soon as I found out what they were doing, I said, okay, all of this stops now. And just through an act of will, said, this will not go this direction. And as soon as I put forth that act of will, all of these things, the negativity ceased, and the poltergeist resumed its harmless aspects. And what that taught me is that, I'm sometimes asked, do you think people can cast spells or can exert an outward influence to you? And I think that our will is always, it's what our will determines. But you also have to be conscious. You have to sort of shield yourself. And I have learned that I have to have developed a strong belief that I'm protected, so that my unconscious doesn't believe that I'm not protected and allow these things to occur. And when you do that, you are protected.
So your sense is that these various events are taking place at another level of reality that's related to the